I'm Vicky, and in this video I'm going to show you how I make strapless dresses. There's a few different ways that you can sew strapless dresses. This is the method that I prefer. I do use a couple of other different techniques depending on what I'm doing, but this is the most common method that I use. So in this part I'm going to show you how I cut and stitch the layers together and how I put the boning into the lining. Then in part 2 I'll show you how I'm going to add tulle to the skirt of the outside layer, how I put the zip in and join it and finish it and hem it, and then how I'm going to add some lace and crystal embellishments to the bodice as well. So let's get started. To make my strapless dress, I'm using my standard size 12 bodice pattern, which is my pattern that I've made that I use for most of my strapless dresses that aren't a full corset. Most commercial pattern companies have a strapless bodice pattern or a strapless dress pattern that you can buy and use that have this waist seam. I'd suggest making a toile out of some calico or some cheap cotton just to check the fit of it before you go ahead and make it up in your right fabrics. I like a bodice pattern that is in 2 pieces at the back. Sometimes you'll find that they just have one solid piece from the side back to the centre back, but I like having this seam because it means you can just alter it a little bit here. Sometimes, especially with larger sizes, you'll need to add a bit here so you don't get that back squish going on. So this is how my pattern looks. Once you're happy with the fit of your pattern, go ahead and cut out your bodice pieces. So I've cut 2 sets, one for the lining and one for the outside, out of black satin, which I've interfaced. So for the lining and the outside, I've got my front and side front pieces, side back pieces, and my centre back pieces. Next I'm going to join all of my lining pieces together and press all the seams open apart from the side front seam, which I'm going to press towards the centre front. So this is my bodice lining all joined together from the outside. I sewed my hanging ribbons into the side seams while I was sewing it. And then here's how it looks on the inside with the side and back seams pressed open and the side front seams pressed towards the middle. They don't stay there very well at the minute, but they will once I've stitched boning onto them. So the outside fabric for my dress is purple sequins and black tulle. So I'm now going to take each piece of interface satin for the outside of my bodice, and I'm going to tack onto it a piece of the purple sequins and a double layer of black tulle. So these are my bodice pieces for the outside with 1 layer of purple sequins and 2 layers of black tulle tacked onto them. So now I'm going to join these together and press the seams open. So this is how the outside of the bodice looks with all the seams sewn together, and I've pressed all of the seams on the inside open, including the side front seam, which I've clipped and pressed open this time. At this point I'm going to put the 2 bodice parts to one side and start work on the skirt. If you want to, you can at this point bone your bodice lining and join the tops together and then attach your skirts afterwards, but I prefer to attach my skirts to both halves before I work on the boning and join the tops. There's no right or wrong for which way you do it. I like to attach my skirts and then join the top because it means that the bodice isn't joined at the waist with a stitch and then the skirt's attached to it, which means that if I ever need to get inside and do an alteration, it's a lot easier. Next I'm going to cut out my skirt lining and outside fabric. So this is my pattern. So I've got my centre front, which is cut on a fold, side front, side back and centre back. You can see it's quite full at the bottom. So I'm going to cut the lining out of black lining fabric and the outside out of my purple sequin fabric. I'm then going to join and press open all of the seams on the purple sequin fabric. On the lining I'm going to join and press open all of the seams except for the centre back seam, which I'm going to leave completely open for now. So this is my lining all together and pressed with the centre back seam left open, and I've sewn my fabric content and Made in Australia label and washing instruction label in the side seams as I put that together. And this is my sequin layer with all of the seams joined and pressed. Next I'm working on the lining of the dress and I'm pinning the skirt to the bodice right sides together. Then I'm going to stitch my seam allowance and then I'm going to press the seam upwards towards the bodice. See, having the centre back seam of the skirt open at this point makes it a lot easier. Okay, so my bodice and skirt are joined and I've pressed my seam upwards. Next I'm going to sew the boning in, and I'm using this Ridgeline sew through boning. It's a plastic boning that you can stitch straight through. I've got it in two different widths. That one's about 12 mil and that one's about an 8 mil. To sew it I'm going to just use a regular Schmetz needle in size 80 or 12. I put my boning in at this point because it means that I can push my boning right down to the seam. If you sew your boning on before you join your skirt and your bodice together, you sometimes find you end up with a little gap because you don't want to sew right down to where you're going to join in case you go too far. And that can lead to your bodice just sort of buckling up a little bit at the bottom. So I find by doing it this way and stitching boning right against here, and I hide the ends underneath the seam allowance here, I find that just helps keep your bodice smoother on the outside. I'm going to use the thinner boning at the centre front and over the bust seams because it's easier to curve over the bust seams, and then the thicker boning I'm going to use on the side and side back seams and in the centre of each of these panels, and I'm going to do one just in from the zip as well. And to stitch it in, I stitch along both sides. You can find if you just stitch down the middle it can wobble, but if you stitch a neat line down each side of it, it sits a lot neater. And then to tip the boning at the top, I just use an offcut of my Interface satin from when I cut the bodice, and I just cut a small part and wrap it around the end of the boning as I stitch it in. Using my air erasing pen, I've marked my centre front and then I've measured out from there and marked where I want my two bones that are going to be on the front. And then I put an X either side so I know which side of that line I'm going to stitch them to. And then I've marked 2 centimetres down from the top so I know where to cut the bone to as well. So my seam allowance is 1.5 centimetres, so by doing it 2 centimetres I know I'm not going to catch them or that they'll be too long when I come to join the lining and the outside together. I also don't cut my bones before I stitch them. I start stitching and then as I get up here I cut it to exactly the right length as I want it. So to stitch it in, I'm going to line that up with that, stitch it in place all the way up to here and trim it and put my little bit of fabric over the end, stitch across there and then turn it around and stitch back down the other side. I've got a pair of scissors that I keep for cutting boning so I don't ruin my fabric scissors. So I'm just keeping the boning lined up with the line that I've drawn, and I'm just stitching right in that first sort of dip there. And I do it so the boning curves this way because it comes off a roll, so it's got a bit of curve to it, so you can see it's curving down slightly there. So I find it sits neater against your body with the ends curving towards your body. If it's the other way up, you can end up with things just sort of curving outwards and holding the fabric a bit funny on the finished garment. So have your curve this way so it's curving that way. So now I'm getting towards the end. I'm going to cut that. I'm at the wrong angle. I'm going to stand up. And then take my little bit of Interface satin and just wrap it around the edge. And that helps just helps stop the bone rubbing through the fabric. Make sure you keep your hanging loops and other bits of fabric out of the way. Now I'm going to come back down the other side. That's how it looks on the right side of the lining. So you've just got that neat little line of stitching. And that's how it looks on the inside. Now the side front seams going over the bust are the trickiest ones because you've got to get the boning, which is straight, around a curve. So you definitely want to use the thinner width of boning for this. And I start the same way. So I've marked my 2 centimetres at the top where I need to stop. So I'm going to start the same way and put my boning right down to the seam where the skirt joins on. And this time I'm going to line it up against the stitching. So as you stitch up this curved seam, you just need to make sure it stays open really neatly. Now I press my seam forward. You can press it open if you want to. See what works for you. Now then, as you get to the curve of the bust, you have to just gradually curve it around, making sure you're not catching. It's really easy to get this part caught underneath. So making sure that seam stays really open. So at this point I'm just going to check that I've got that seam open nicely and I haven't caught any fabric, and it looks fine. So now I'm going to come back down the other side. So this is our bust seam boning on the inside, and then on the right side of the lining, once you curve it, that's how it looks. So it's tricky and it is really easy to get fabric caught underneath it, but once it's in, it gives beautiful support to that bust seam. So now I'm going to do the other bust seam, then I'm going to switch to the thicker boning and do them 1, 2, 3, 4, and then one about 2 centimeters in from where the finished zip will be. So this is how my dress lining looks with all of the boning sewn in. You can see I've done this one, that purple line there is where the zip will finish. So I've just done it in from there. If it's too near the zip, it makes it a bit difficult to zip up. Then I've got them on the seams and in the middle of each panel as well. You can just do them on the seams if you want to. I find it just gives an extra nice bit of support to have them in the middle of each panel too. But it's totally up to you how many bones you use and where you put them. The last jobs I need to do on the lining are just to sew my brand and size labels in, and then I'm going to stitch the centre back seam together, but I'm going to stop about halfway up because I'm going to do a bag hem later on, and if I leave the seam fairly open it makes it easier to pull the hem through to stitch it. So this is the lining all finished, so you can see the curve of the boning, the way we put it in is holding it really nicely. The dress is too big for the dress form I've got, unfortunately, but you can get the idea. At this point, if you want to use bust cups, you can sew your bust cups in as well. Then at the back, you can see I've left a big gap on this centre back seam so that I can pull the hem through when we do the bag hem later on. So that's it for part 1. In part 2, I'll show you how I add the tulle to the skirt and put the zip in, and then how I join the whole dress together, hem it and embellish it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you click the notification bell so you can get notified as soon as I put part 2 up, which will hopefully be later this week. If this is now the future and part 2's up, it will be linked in the description and up there right now. So go watch it. Thanks for watching.